Joby Warrick, Washington Post correspondent who penned that article, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. for more on this. Joby, appreciate very much your speaking with us here on WION. Let me begin by asking you, this is of course a report which has dominated discourse over the last few hours. What sort of evidence is something that has been spoken of through those intercepts that gives us concrete information that Baghdadi is alive?
Well, it's always a little less than concrete, unfortunately. I refer to Baghdadi as the invisible man of ISIS. Even though he's the leader, there have actually been more reports about his death and capture than actual sightings, of confirmed sightings or statements, official activities. And so we have to kind of piece together the little bits of evidence that we do see. And one of the more interesting ones in recent weeks has been the capture of some high-level officials who have been with him recently. And their statements have been corroborated by others. And so we do have a fairly good sense now that he is alive, that he is sort of lurking in the shadows, deliberately staying kind of below the radar screen, but trying to work on the long-term project, trying to make sure that ISIS as an organization survives, even if the caliphate doesn't.
Joby, this is indeed not the first time that reports suggest that al-Baghdadi is alive. Several reports earlier have said that he's dead. So what, according to you, would be the reason to believe that he's alive? Is there a location that's been pointed out? What does this really also tell us about the operations that have been carried out all this while to capture him?
Yes. So, yeah, the reports about his death have sometimes been somewhat persuasive. As we might recall, just a few months ago, the Russians claimed they had killed him in an airstrike, and Russian officials were saying very positively that they had confirmation that he was dead. The U.S. officials and some of our allies in the regions held back, and they didn't confirm it because it just really wasn't the kind of evidence that you normally would see after the loss of a high-level leader, the kinds of communication between operatives, for example. So instead, they began looking to see what other evidence existed, and the closer we get to Baghdadi's inner circle, the more we see indications that he is indeed alive. This does suggest that we've been very bad, actually, at trying to locate him specifically. This is always hard to find a single leader. On the other hand, his base, his sanctuary, keeps shrinking and shrinking. And so the suggestion is, if he is still in Syria somewhere, eventually we should be able to pinpoint him. But he does have, dispersed networks. There could be ways for him to slip into Turkey or to some other place and elude capture once again, as indeed Osama bin Laden did for years.
There's also the mention of footage that report refers to. If you can elaborate for our viewers what exactly that footage contained.
Right. So the only real footage of him speaking was when he first went to a mosque in Mosul, Iraq, and climbed up to declare the start of the caliphate. This is the only time since his young adulthood that we know of when he's allowed himself to be photographed. And if you see stories about Baghdadi, you see these same images again and again because he spoke for about 20 minutes and allowed himself to be viewed in a very ceremonial way. Since then, he's put out about 5 audio tapes. So we have seen not video footage, but confirmable spoken statements by him as recently as September of last year, just before the fall of Raqqa. So we know that at least that recently he was still alive, and he was actually doing those audio statements to push back on reports that he's been killed. On the other hand, if you're invisible to the degree that he has been, you can argue that he hasn't been very effective because you can't rally your troops, you can't inspire people abroad if no one knows if you're alive or dead, and that's kind of the predicament that Baghdadi is in.
Let me also ask you of reactions, if any, that have come in post that report that was published by you has, of course, dominated discourse. But any reaction that's come in to any extent from the government?
No denial, certainly, because we talk to people at senior levels about Baghdadi's whereabouts. We always ask the question, where is he? And the statements lately to us have been fairly positive, that they don't have 100% confirmation, but all the evidence they've seen indicates that he was alive at least until very recently. So there's been no denials or pushback in that sense. We have heard from people, for example, that know his case very well, and they're not surprised that he has been dedicating himself to the survival of the ideology, working on things like curricula, trying to settle ideological disputes between his followers, because that's something very important to him. He is an academic, a university professor, an Islamic scholar by background. So it's not too surprising that he would be devoting his energies and efforts in that area. And that gels, or is something that seems familiar to people that know him as a person, as a personality. That's the kind of thing he likes to do.